The third lecture, delivered by Professor George Weigel in the series John Paul II, The Quintessence, will focus on the essential motives and events from the first decade of Pope John Paul II's pontificate. It is not an exaggeration to say that the great Pope, from a faraway country, as he introduced himself to the world on the day of his election, played a key role in defining the course of modern history. As a leader of the free people, he called for and showed the path to liberation from evil, not only in the social or political context, but most importantly in the moral and spiritual sense in each individual life. The lecture could not have been produced without the support of the donors and friends of the St. Nicholas Foundation and the St. John Paul II Institute of Culture at the Pontifical University of St. Thomas Aquinas. We are most grateful for the generosity and allowing us to develop projects like this, one and many more. For more information, we encourage you to visit our website at Angelicum IT and check out the study offer at the St. John Paul II Institute of Culture in Rome. I am pleased to invite you to the lecture titled John Paul II, Aroused Consciences Changing History. Professor Weigel, the floor is yours.
John Paul II was Bishop of Rome, Universal Pastor of the Church, for 26 and a half years, the second longest pontificate in reliably recorded history. Being the Pope means being on call 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year. So in the almost 10,000 days of John Paul II's papacy, many, many things were going on all at the same time. Things in the world, things in the church, things at the intersection of the church and the world. There's a certain artificiality in dividing a papacy this long into periods, but it also helps to simplify things a bit. So I would like to talk now about the first 10 or 11 years of the pontificate of John Paul II. He announced, in a sense, the program of his pontificate at the Mass publicly inaugurating his papacy in St. Peter's Square in Rome on October 22nd, 1978. There was a vast throng present, well over 500,000 people spilling out of the square down the Via della Conciliazione toward the Tiber River. And in that remarkable setting, the stage, if you will, on which the drama of the Catholic Church and its interaction with the world would play out for over a quarter of a century, he gave a remarkable homily, remarkable sermon. Speaking in Italian, he struck what would become the great motto of his pontificate. Non abbiate paura. Non abbiate paura. Be not afraid. Open the doors to Christ. Those phrases were repeated several times during this homily, and they became a kind of theme of the entire pontificate. For Karol Wojtyła, Pope John Paul II wanted to remind both the Church and the world that it was Christ who shows us the truth about ourselves while also showing us the face of the Father of mercies, who welcomes the prodigals home and restores to them the dignity of their humanity. There was a French journalist in St. Peter's Square on that October day in 1978. His name was André Frossard, and he had grown up in the fashionable atheism of post-war Paris. He had come to Christian faith as an adult, and in the story that he sent back to his Parisian newspaper about the inaugural Mass of Pope John Paul II, he used a brilliant sentence that captured the drama of that moment and what it would mean for the future when he wrote, "This is not a pope from Poland, this is a pope from Galilee. This is a pope who is going to act in the world like the first apostles did. Men so on fire with the Holy Spirit, men so convinced of the truth revealed in Jesus Christ that they went out and converted a great portion of the Mediterranean world. This is not a pope from Poland. This is a pope from Galilee. This is going to be an epic biblical pontificate." John Paul II proved André Frossard right in several gestures that he made at the beginning, the very beginning of his pontificate. Shortly after that inaugural Mass on October 22nd, 1978, John Paul II made a pilgrimage to the Italian Marian shrine of Mentorella. Having heard that the Pope would be there on a Sunday, a vast crowd came, including men and women who had fled communist oppression in East Central Europe. At the end of that pilgrimage, as John Paul II was leaving Mentorella, someone in the crowd from Central Europe said, "Holy Father, do not forget the Church of Silence." To which John Paul II immediately responded, "It is no longer the Church of Silence because it speaks with my voice. It is no longer a Church of Silence because it has a voice in the Bishop of Rome." Shortly after that, John Paul II received in private audience the heroic leader of the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church, Joseph Slipyj, who had been made a cardinal by Pope John XXIII. Slipyj was arrested by the NKVD, the Soviet secret police, towards the end of the Second World War, spent 17 years in the Gulag, labor camps, was brought back to Rome in a deal that John XXIII made with Premier Khrushchev of the Soviet Union, but had been largely ignored by official Rome for the next 15 or so years. The Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church, of which Slipyj was the head, was like the Polish Church. Both were the repositories of national memory and national identity in countries that had been declared no longer to exist. Ukraine had been absorbed into the Soviet Union, was one of these fake Soviet republics. Poland, between 1795 and 1918, was simply obliterated from the map of Europe. John Paul II's meeting with Slipyj, with Cardinal Slipyj, which was publicly gazetted in the Vatican Bulletin, photographs and everything else, was a very powerful signal to the leadership of the Soviet Union that things had changed. This was itself confirmation of the view of Soviet secret police head Yuri Andropov, who was one of the two men who immediately understood that the election of a Polish pope was a world historical event that was going to make a difference, even if we couldn't know exactly how that difference would play itself out. The first man who understood that instantaneously was the great Soviet writer, novelist, dissident, Alexander Solzhenitsyn. Solzhenitsyn was living in exile in Cavendish, Vermont. On October 16, 1978, he had gone to the local grocery store to get some provisions for his family. He heard on the radio that the Archbishop of Krakow in Poland had been elected pope. And he rushed back to his home and announced to his family and his housekeeper, who later told me the story, "This is the most important thing that has happened since World War I. It's going to change everything." Spiritual power was being brought into the contest for human freedom. The second person who immediately understood that this was a decisive event in world history was, as I said, Yuri Andropov, the head of the Soviet secret police, the KGB, who immediately ordered a study of the implications of the election of a Pole as Bishop of Rome, a man not afraid to speak out, a man, in fact, preaching the theme, "Be not afraid." And within a month, there was a report to the Politburo of the Soviet Communist Party that this was a very dangerous adversary. That judgment was underscored again immediately after the Pope's election when he sent his Cardinal Zucchetto, that little skull cap that senior clerics wear, to Lithuania, another country that had been denied its historical reality by absorption into the Soviet Union, a country that was close to Karol Wojtyła's heart. He had family roots in Lithuania, which was once united with Poland in a great commonwealth. And by sending his Cardinal Zucchetto to the Ostrobrama shrine in Vilnius, in Lithuania, he was again signaling the Church of Silence now has a voice. It speaks with my voice. And in the case of Lithuania, it would soon begin to speak with the voice of the Lithuanian Catholic Committee for Believers' Rights, and with the creation of the longest-running underground publication in the Soviet Union called the Chronicle of the Catholic Church in Lithuania, which was published and snuck out to the West, telling the story of Lithuanian Catholics and others' struggle for freedom. Be Not Afraid opened the doors to Christ, also shaped John Paul II's first pastoral pilgrimage to his native Poland, which took place between June 2nd and June 10th, 1979. God often has an ironic sense of humor. It was obvious that a Polish pope was going to come back to Poland at some point. The original proposal was that the Pope would return to Poland for only 2 days in May 1979 to celebrate the feast of St. Stanisław, John Paul II's predecessor as Bishop of Krakow. This was not a good idea as far as the Polish authorities were concerned, because Stanisław had been martyred by an aggressive king and symbolized the freedom of the church over against state power, symbolized the role of the bishop as the defender of the basic human rights of his people. So the communist authorities said no to a 2-day visit in May, but agreed to a 9-day visit in June. This was another example of what one of Wojtyła's colleagues in Krakow said to me years later that the Holy Spirit can work by darkening minds as well as enlightening them. The 9 days of John Paul II in June 1979 were days that in retrospect we can see the history of the 20th century turning in a basic way and in a more humane direction. He landed at Warsaw Airport on June 2nd, 1979, kissed the ground, said hello to the Polish communist authorities, and then proceeded to ignore them for the next 9 days. Not once in those 9 days, in over 50 addresses of one sort or another, not once did John Paul II speak of politics or economics. Rather, he preached over 50 variations on one great theme to this people he knew so well. What was that theme? You are not who they, these communist authorities who have been rewriting Polish history and attempting to eradicate Polish culture, you are not who they say you are. Permit me to remind you who you are. You are a people with a distinctive history, a distinctive culture, and at the center of that culture is your Catholic faith, is your belief in the God of the Bible and his incarnate Son, Jesus of Nazareth. If you own that, if you take that to yourselves, if you reclaim the truth about yourselves, if you live in that truth, you will eventually find tools of resistance that communism cannot match. Over the 9 days of John Paul II in June 1979, the Pope was seen in person by more than 1/3 of the Polish population, well over 10 million people. Everyone else heard him either on edited material in the communist-controlled media or more openly on the 2 radios that the United States government sponsored in order to bring the truth of news to communist-occupied Central and Eastern Europe, Radio Free Europe, and Radio Liberty. The Church made a very important decision right before the Pope arrived. It insisted in the planning for this visit that the Church would do crowd control. The Church would manage this enormous outpouring of popular piety and indeed popular dissent. Why was that important? Because Poles had been told since 1945, you can't run your own lives. We will run your lives for you because we, the communists, are on the right side of history and we know how to do this. For the Church to insist that it would be the manager, it would provide the marshals to control the crowds, it would manage these events, these great outdoor liturgies, addresses to students, addresses to minors, and so forth and so on. That was a brilliant move, and 2 things happened because of it. Those more than 10 million people who saw the Pope live saw how many others of them there were. We are not alone. I'm not the only one thinking communism is a lie and I don't like it. We're not alone. And then secondly, we can manage our own lives. Even in this extraordinary business of managing crowds of hundreds of people, hundreds of thousands of people, in some cases 500,000. We can manage our own lives. The great historian Norman Davies, who has written what I think is still regarded as a standard history of Poland, observed years later that what the people of Poland saw with John Paul II is real authority. This is what real authority looks like. Real authority looks like someone speaking the truth and summoning us to lead lives of nobility. That's what real authority looks like, not this artificial authority that had been running Poland since 1945. A close friend of mine, who was a young university student in those days, attended many of these great events, said that its effect on him was, I don't have to live the communist lie. I may never be fully free, but I can live as if I am free. And that means living in the truth about the dignity of the human person, about the human capacity for nobility, the truth that communism is a lie. We'll live against that. I can live in the truth. Evidently, tens of thousands, indeed hundreds of thousands, millions of Poles learned that same lesson. Because within a year of John Paul II's departure from Krakow on June 10th, 1979, the Solidarity trade union had begun to be formed in the shipyards in Gdansk in the north of Poland. And out of that grew a vast movement for social change that eventually involved almost a third of the country. The Solidarity Union and movement was another example of what we might call the John Paul II difference or the Karol Wojtyła difference. There had been spasms of revolt against the communist regime in Poland before. One was in 1956, another in 1968, another in 1970. These were largely workers' revolts in response to rises in food prices, and they all fizzled out, not simply because the communists had a monopoly of material force or power, but because Polish dissidents were disunited. Workers and intellectuals, academics, people of culture were not working together. Believers and non-believers were not working together. People with a conservative view of politics and people with a liberal or progressive view of politics were not working together. During his years as Archbishop of Krakow, Karol Wojtyła had worked to bring together these different groups and get them used to talking to each other. So when the occupation strike broke out in the Gdansk shipyard in the fall of 1980, things were immediately different because the workers called in men and women of ideas to help them formulate their demands and to work with them on designing this new entity, a free and self-governing trade union in a communist country. This was an expression not only of political common sense, but of what John Paul II had long claimed to be the preeminent social virtue, which was the virtue of solidarity, the capacity to feel a responsibility to those around us and to act on that responsibility. A French philosopher of the mid-20th century, Jacques Maritain, whom Karol Wojtyła had read, called this civic friendship. Civic friendship had been shattered in Poland by the Nazi occupation during the Second World War and by the communist occupation after that. By building civic friendship in Krakow during his time as Archbishop and by summoning his people to civic friendship during those 9 days of June 1979, John Paul II, in fact, helped achieve what he had promised, that people living in the truth, people determined to live according to what their conscience told them was true, would find tools of resistance that communism could not match. John Paul II's great friend, Father Joseph Tichenor, a distinguished philosopher, once said that solidarity, both the Union and the movement, was a great forest planted by aroused consciences. That's a terrific image, and it's true. Aroused consciences can bend the course of history in a more humane direction. Now, needless to say, all of this going on in Poland was very bad news in Moscow. And shortly after the formation of the Solidarity Union, in late 1980, some 23 Warsaw Pact army divisions surrounded Poland. It looked like there was going to be an invasion, a military intervention by the Soviet Union and other Warsaw Pact countries, as there had been in Czechoslovakia in 1968, and it didn't happen. Why didn't it happen? Well, there were some political, military reasons why it didn't happen. The leaders of the Western world quietly made it known to the leaders of the Soviet Union that they would not tolerate this and that there would be severe economic consequences for the Soviet Union if it invaded Poland. The American Trade Union Federation, the AFL-CIO, led by a man named Lane Kirkland, worked with President Jimmy Carter's national security advisor, a native Pole named Zbigniew Brzezinski, to organize a global union boycott of Soviet shipping. Had there been an invasion of Poland, trade unions around the world told them, we will not load your ships, we will not unload your ships, we won't load your planes, we won't unload your planes. You're going to be cut off from commerce throughout the world. And then there was John Paul II, who, while this drama was playing out, wrote a letter to Leonid Brezhnev, the head of the Soviet Communist Party, in which he said that were the Soviet Union to invade, he would be forced to describe this as a repetition of what had happened to Poland in 1939, when it was not only invaded by the German army, but by the Red Army. An invasion did not happen then, but 6 months later, something did. John Paul II was being driven into St. Peter's Square on May 13th, 1981, to hold an outdoor general audience, as popes do on Wednesdays of virtually every week of the year. During his drive around the periphery of St. Peter's Square, a professional assassin named Mehmet Ali Agca, a Turk, standing 7 feet from the Pope, fired 3 shots. One hit nothing except the car. The other grazed the Pope's finger, and the third went into his body, where it missed his abdominal aorta by a few millimeters. Had that major carrier of blood been severed, the Pope would have died in 30 seconds. The bullet missed by millimeters. And Agca's aim was frustrated by the Pope being handed a child to kiss and handing the child back to his parents just as the assassin was taking aim. Pope was rushed to the hospital, to the Policlinico Agostino Gemelli in Rome, where after a 6-hour operation, his life was saved. Some months later, it turned out that he had received a tainted or a pint of blood in the course of that operation. So he had to go back to the hospital while that virus, called a cytomegalovirus, worked its way out of his system. But he survived the assassination attempt. In his mind, he survived it because, as he would put it, one hand fired and another guided the bullet. Meaning, having put himself under the protection of the Virgin Mary, Aja fired the bullet, but Mary's hand guided it. This remarkable incident, something that had not happened like this ever before in the 2,000-year history of the papacy. I mean, popes had been murdered before, popes had been martyred before. Nothing quite like this had ever happened before. Became a kind of turning point in the pontificate. Rather than scaring the Pope, those who had planned this, and there is every reason to believe that this was planned by the Soviet authorities, acting through various cutouts between themselves and Rome. Rather than being scared by this, the Pope was made even more determined to keep speaking truth to power. And that became even more urgent when later that year, on December 13th, the night of December 12, 1981, the Polish communist regime imposed martial law on the country, arrested all the leaders of the Solidarity movement and many of their followers in an attempt to shut this resistance down. Over the next several years, John Paul II supported the underground Solidarity movement, maintained contact with the leaders of the movement, and then returned to Poland in June 1983, while martial law was still officially in force, and gave a lesson in hope. Karol Wojtyła knew how to play a scene. He had spent a lot of time in the theater as an actor. As a young man, he knew how to play a scene. And whereas in 1979 he had virtually bounced out of the plane, kissed the ground at Warsaw Airport, in 1983 he slowly walks off the plane with a look of great concern on his face and stands there while he is greeted by the Polish authorities. And an elderly woman standing in the crowd said to a British writer, right on that spot, "Look, he is sad. He understands." Without speaking a word, John Paul II had said to his people, "I know what you're going through. I went through this myself during the Second World War. Be not afraid." That second visit to a Poland crushed so often by material force rallied people's spirits. It lifted up their hearts, and slowly the resistance to communism began to reassert itself. Martial law was ended, and the Solidarity movement, which now encompassed millions of people, tens of millions of people, began the slow march towards self-liberation. The Pope returned to Poland in June 1987 for his third visit, and interestingly enough, talked about a future of freedom. That future would not arrive for 2 years, but he already saw that the dynamics of the situation were leading to the auto-liberation of Poland. And indeed, later that summer, he asked two friends of his who were spending some vacation time with him at the papal villa in Castel Gandolfo, "Is Poland ready for freedom?" And they immediately responded, "That's science fiction for us. That just isn't going to happen. And he said, no, it's going to happen, and it's going to happen soon, and Poland needs to be ready for it. And of course, he was right, because by the end of 1988, beginning of 1989, it was absolutely clear to the Polish authorities that they had to enter some sort of negotiation with the leaders of the Solidarity movement if the country were not simply going to fall apart. The results of those so-called roundtable talks were a series of semi-free elections in which, in the freely contested seats, Solidarity won everything. Not a single communist candidate won. And in another beautiful irony, the communist authorities, who were not very bright, had created ballots where you had to cross off names rather than write in names or put a check mark beside somebody's name. So people had the delicious pleasure of crossing out the names of one communist candidate after another. Thus, by September of 1989, the first non-communist prime minister of Poland, Tadeusz Mazowiecki, was installed, and throughout Central and Eastern Europe, there was a real domino effect. Not the domino effect of countries falling to communism, but the domino effect of countries self-liberating from communism. The revolution of conscience that John Paul II ignited in June 1979 led to not only a different kind of political revolution without massive bloodshed, nonviolent, civic. It reminded the world of a truth of history. For 200 years at least, since the French Revolution, the world had come to think that the quest for political power, understood as my capacity to impose my will on you, was the driver of history. A second view, the Marxist view, was that economics was the driver of history. Impersonal economic forces made history go. You put those two views together, the Jacobin view of the French Revolution, history is the contest for power. The Marxist view, history is the exhaust fumes of economic forces. You get Marxism, Leninism, you get Lenin, you get Bolshevism, you get tens of millions of corpses. John Paul II's revolution of conscience reminded the world that culture is the driver of history over the long haul, and at the heart of culture is cult or religion, what people cherish, what they worship, what they're willing to stake their lives on. John Paul II reminded human beings that we are by nature theotropic. We are ordered to worship something. That's just built into us. The question is whether we're going to worship true gods or false gods. A British historian named Richard Crossman, who, like many people in the 1930s, was a theoretical Marxist, edited a book of essays some decades later called The God That Failed. And it was a half a dozen or more British intellectuals and political people explaining how they had worked their way out of Marxism. That Marxism was the God that failed. Communism was the God that failed. John Paul II demonstrated that the true God, the worship of the true God, the worship of the God of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Jesus, can be a liberating force in human affairs. This led to a remarkable judgment on the day that John Paul II died, April 2nd, 2005. One of the American television networks, shortly after the Pope's death, got Henry Kissinger on the phone line, and asked him What did John Paul II mean for the world? And Kissinger, who was not a Catholic, who was not a particularly religious man, said that John Paul II was the emblematic figure of the second half of the 20th century. That the drama of his life embodied the drama of the second half of the 20th century in a singular way. Some years after that, America's most distinguished historian of the Cold War, Professor John Lewis Gaddis of Yale University, wrote a book called A Short History of the Cold War, and in it he said the beginning of the end of European communism came on June 2nd, 1979, when John Paul II stepped off the plane at Warsaw Airport and ignited a revolution of conscience. This is a great story in itself, but it's also a story that tells us something about the human condition in all times and places. And it tells us that living in the truth can be the pathway not simply to personal happiness, but to a more humane society for everyone.